deze zit hij van het College van Promoties van de Technische Universiteit Eindhoven. And I would like to invite the candidate to take his position behind the lectern. Dear candidate, you're ready for the defense?
Yes.
Then I would like to give the floor to the first promoter, Professor Vijs.
Geachte promovendus, dear doctoral candidate, could you explain in about 10 minutes to the audience and to the committee what the main contribution is of your thesis?
Yes, sure. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to my PhD defense. As you probably know by now, the title of my PhD dissertation is Robot Interaction Language, ROILA for short, and I'll quickly tell you what it's all about in this presentation. So, what's the research problem? We all know that speech recognition is difficult, and this table gives you some examples of the kind of situations that you have. So the user says something and the machine thinks that something else was said. The main problem that you can see here is that words sound the same, but they have different meanings, and that's the main barrier that you have with speech recognition. So what do we try to do in our research? So we don't try to improve the recognition technology, but rather we say let's tackle the problem from a different perspective, and why not just design a language which is speech recognition friendly? So a language which is artificial, and it's supposed to be tailored for speech recognition. The whole idea revolved around the concept of let's use the language to talk to robots. So that's why you call it robot interaction language, because the language is intended to be used by humans to talk to robots. All of this means that there's a problem because the language is artificial, it's completely new, which means that humans have to invest some effort in learning the language. And this gives a very interesting criteria, trade-off, that the language has to be recognition friendly and at the same time it's supposed to be easy for humans to learn. And we found out that that was not really easy to do. Something about the methodology, the kind of process that we follow. This diagram summarizes the process. So we started with an overview of languages, both artificial and natural. We looked at what we could learn from them and incorporate them into ROILA. And then we did vocabulary generation, so we generated the vocabulary, we evaluated it, and we did this one cycle, and then we designed the grammar, implemented ROILA in terms of recognition and speech synthesis, that's text-to-speech. And then finally we did an evaluation at the high school, at the Dutch high school in Eindhoven with school children. So what is the vocabulary generation and how is it done? So we used a genetic algorithm, with the goal of the algorithm was that it had to find really the best vocabulary. And what do we mean when we say the best vocabulary? It means that the words of the vocabulary have the least acoustic confusion amongst them. And we would hope that these words would then ultimately be easy for the recognizer. And to do this, we use a phoneme confusion matrix as the fitness function, which basically gave the probability of one phoneme being confused with another. We had 8 word types and using 16 phonemes, so we had 11 consonants, 5 vowels, and combinations of those form the word types. And semantics came from Basic English and Tokipona. So now once we had the first vocabulary by means of the genetic algorithm, we then did a very quick evaluation. We asked participants to record those words, both ROILA and English, and they were passed through the Sphinx 4 recognizer. The first results show that there was no significant improvement. So both ROILA and English were doing equally, well, they're performing equally. But we found out that CV type words, so words formed with constant vowels syllables, were doing much better. So we thought, why not just make a new vocabulary which only has CV units and see if it does better than English, and we found that it does. So we found a significant difference, and we found out that such words were doing better ROILA words were doing better against English. And then naturally the next step was the design of the grammar. So we used the question, options, and criteria technique, which basically means that we had a number of criteria. So let's say, is this grammatical marking good for recognition accuracy? Is it good for learnability? And so on. And all that, and what that meant was that at the end we had a regular grammar, so we had no exceptions, unlike natural languages. and grammar was represented by word markers. So if you see this table here, it gives you an example. When you want to say past tense in English, you say I turned left, and you add an ed at the end of the word. But in ROILA, you just add the word marker, and that represents the past tense, in this case. Now we implemented, once we had the linguistic elements in place, we implemented ROILA. We used the Sphinx 4 speech recognizer, which is open source. It allows for the addition of a language. And we used, for speech synthesis, we used Festival, which is also open source. What was the robotic platform that we used? We were very lucky to visit Lego Minds, the headquarters of Lego in Billund. And there were, as an establishment of a cooperation, they gave us 20 Mindstorm boxes, which we could use for the development of the project. So once we had ROILA implemented in the form of Lego robots, we then went to a school to evaluate it. So children were actually taught ROILA for 3 weeks as part of their science class. So it was part of their whole curriculum. And we had about 100 high school students who were learning ROILA. There were 3 ROILA lessons once every week, having a theoretical and a practical part. Theoretical part, they would learn about ROILA. Practical part, they would actually use the ROILA, what they learned, and talk to the robots. So once we had given some training, then we established some research questions because we wanted to really find out what's the accuracy that, in terms of ROILA against English. So we had 3 research questions. First, do the children think that ROILA is easier to use? The second, is it really what we think, is it better than English in terms of accuracy? And third, if the accuracy is higher, how much time do children have to interact before their learning effort pays off? Because they obviously spend some time learning the language. What was the procedure? So we had a very simple game. They would play the game for 10 minutes, both English, both ROILA. It was built, the game rules were built on what they had done in the lessons. It was a simple navigation and a shooting game. And we had 35 students who took part. For the main part was that we, to get the accuracy, we had to know what was being said by the user. That came from the video, and what was recognized came from system logs. The measurements, so subjective measurement was the SASI ratings, standard speech-based questionnaire. And the other objective measurements were like number of commands, word accuracy, semantic accuracy, and sentence accuracy. So what were the results? First, the subjective ratings. ROILA was evaluated better on all SASI factors. I only show the significant ones here. So, and if I move on to the objective measurements or the recognition accuracy measurements, I see that again ROILA is doing better on the last 3, although semantic accuracy is not significant. And number of commands, the children said more commands in English. This was an interesting result, and we speculated why that would happen, because we thought that maybe the recognition accuracy in English was so bad that they had to keep on repeating their commands. So that could be one hypothesis. So what does that all mean in terms of answering the research questions? So the first question, based on the SASI ratings, they found it easier to use. Second question, we think that ROILA did perform better. I mean, at least the results show that. And third question, I don't show the calculations here in view of time, but we found out that to cover their learning effort, they would need to interact with the system for 38 hours. And it shows that this is quite a long time, and the benefit lies in long-term use. Something about the limitations. So the first thing was we had the Dutch dialect was a problem. So we used, for example, they had problems with English words. And another main limitation is that we only tested a subset of ROILA, so we didn't test the entire language, so to say. The acoustic model we used was of American English, so we didn't use a specific ROILA acoustic model, because to create an acoustic model for ROILA would require a lot of data. So lastly, what does the future hold for ROILA? Did we think that there are 2 roadmaps that could be followed? We don't argue which one is better, but the first is having very standardized control. So you have a ROILA book, and that determines exactly what the whole rules are and what the principles are. And the second is a more free, customized development. Because our whole approach is scalable, So people can add words, they can add grammar rules, and they can even add their own semantics, and hence they can have their own version of ROILA. And that would be the end of the presentation.
Professor Vijs, are you satisfied with the answer given?
Yes, most certainly. Thank you.
Okay, then Eindhoven University of Technology is most happy that in our PhD's exam people participate from outside our university. The doctoral degree is our highest degree, and therefore we want to maintain high quality standards, and they can only be maintained by the participation of external committee members to sessions like this. In this context, I want to recognize the presence of Professor Lyon from Ritsumeikan University in Japan, from Professor De Lange from the University of Utrecht, and from Professor Kramer of the University of Tilburg. Eindhoven University is grateful that you are here today, and we warmly appreciate your participation in this committee. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Lyon from Ritsumeikan University in Japan. Professor Lyon, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So, is the microphone working?
You have to push this
button. I should push the gray. Okay. So how's that?
That works.
Okay. Excellent. Okay. So I'm going to start with a fairly general question. In the introduction to your thesis, you have a brief section describing the difficulties of current speech recognition technology in recognizing natural languages. You also mentioned briefly in your presentation difficulty of segmenting words. I'm wondering if you can elaborate somewhat on the difficulties of current speech recognition technology. And as a second part of this question, I would like it if you could outline the key points in which your approach has managed to overcome the difficulties faced by speech recognition technology in recognizing natural languages.
Okay. Volgeleerd opponent, thank you for the question. Like you say, in the thesis I tried to elaborate on the current problems of speech recognition. And if you look at how speech recognition works, there are two main components that exist. So you have the acoustic model, which deals with how the sounds are pronounced, and then you have the language model, which is more on syntactic level, and it says how does the grammar look like in terms of how are words followed by each other, in terms of what's the probability of word X being followed by word Y, as an example. So the problems with speech recognition can occur on either of these two levels. So either the words are acoustically confused, so like the example that I showed in my table, or there's a problem in terms of the grammar. Basically, what natural languages, the way they're designed, they're not designed to, let's say, have words that sound as uniquely different from each other. So what we see is that that's why they have this problem of being difficult for a computer or for a machine to recognize. And at the same time, you have the grammar, because like one common principle is that the more, let's say, the more grammar rules you have, the better it is for speech recognition. But then, so basically, these are the problems with speech recognition can occur on these two levels. Either there's a problem with the acoustic, let's say acoustic information or acoustic signal, or there's a problem at the language model or at the grammar. So what we try to do, and one of the key aspects that we try to target, are mainly the acoustic, on the acoustic level. That's why we have this whole genetic algorithm, and we try to see if we can have a vocabulary which it already has words which are acoustically as unique from each other as possible. And hopefully then, at least at that time, we thought that we could be able to improve the performance of recognition. Other general aspects of why speech recognition is difficult, not specifically related to ROILA and to languages, is like, let's say, the dialect. So people have different dialects, and then they speak English in different ways, makes it difficult for the recognizer. So if you have, let's say, ROILA, which is a universal language, you could probably train them in such a way that their dialect is compromised to some extent. Or you could have, let's say, a specific ROILA for different dialects. That would be another approach. So in that way, you could also tackle that problem. Other problems with speech recognition are like ambient sound, but that would of course also apply to the context of ROILA. But yeah, mainly to summarize, we want to see if we could really improve on an acoustic level.
Does it answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Then the opposition will be continued by Professor Kramer from the University of Tilburg.
Thank you. Geachte kandidaat, I read your thesis with great interest. I think that developing an artificial language which humans should learn if they want to communicate with a robot sounds a bit quixotic, and it's perhaps a slightly crazy idea. But then again, crazy ideas are generally the ones that I like best. And who knows, perhaps someday we'll all be speaking ROILA. To some extent, I think that this might depend on how ROILA will develop in the years to come. And you touch on this in chapter 7. And you also mentioned it in your presentation in the slide before this one, where you sketched the two futures that are possible. You said in your thesis and also in your presentation that you don't want to make a decision about that. But I would like to look at them both in a bit more detail and see whether you can make a decision after all. So one approach is a very strict one, the ROILA book approach, where there's only one forum where ROILA can be discussed, and where only a few people are allowed to make changes to the language. And this is the way ROILA has basically been developed up to now. The other approach would be more liberal, where ROILA speakers are allowed to make changes to the language and contribute to it in any way that they desire. Now, I think that the strict approach will probably reduce the probability that we will all learn to speak ROILA. Perhaps the best way to create a community for a language, as is the case for software for instance, is to make it publicly available and adaptable. And this is for instance partly the reason why the open source movement has been such a success. So I hope you agree with that, and if not, then you're allowed to say that in a minute. So I don't think that this is the way to go. So let's consider what would happen if we follow the other route and make ROILA public property. Then I think that ROILA is likely to start changing. For example, it is to be expected that ROILA speakers will start reducing frequent words. And if you look at natural language, then it's not a coincidence that frequent words, such as determinants, words like a and the, or personal pronouns, words like I or he, they're very short, and they're much shorter than their ROILA counterparts. In addition, I think that dialects are more likely to arise again, where Dutch ROILA would gradually become different from, say, Pakistani ROILA. So what I expect that to happen is that over the years ROILA would become gradually more and more like a natural language, and as a result it would get more difficult to recognize ROILA speech automatically. So what are we to do? Do you agree with me that both options for the future could turn out to be problematic, or is my reasoning incorrect, and do you see a way out of this dilemma?
Hooggeleerd opponent, thank you for this question. So yeah, I mean, when I was writing the thesis, this was also a dilemma for us, because when we had several discussions and debates about which do we present this, which path, the path of this path is better, or do we just leave it open? And that's what we decided at the end, because we couldn't make a decision. And now you give very valuable and very interesting and very applicable arguments on why which one path would be better than the other. I think that in the long run, it also depends on the user group. So let's say I took the language and I gave it to children. And at several times during the whole evaluation process, I felt that they wanted to really do something with ROILA, but of course they were restricted. So like one of the very interesting examples would be that, like I had several children come up to me and they said, why doesn't this word mean this word? Because we think it should mean this, you know. They wanted to, they wanted to make several changes to it. So I think that if we give them the basic elements, so if we say, okay, this is the algorithm, and this is the only algorithm that you have to use to generate the vocabulary, and then they can choose their own consonants, they can choose their own vowels, but the algorithm does all the dirty work, and it makes sure that the language remains. It tries to find the best vocabulary still, and the user doesn't need to be concerned with that because so the freedom comes on choosing your phonemes, on choosing your semantics, and we don't deal with semantics. Giving words meanings of your own choice in our project or in our context does not affect the recognition.
Right.
So in summary, and looking at the broader overview and looking at aspects like fun and interest and and like the fact that the children wanted to make so many changes, I would think that the way of letting it be customizable would be the way to go.
Okay, thank you.
This answers your question?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, thank you. The opposition will now be continued by Professor De Lange from the University of Utrecht. Professor De Lange, the floor is yours.
Geachte promovendus, I found your thesis very interesting because at one side you introduce a new language, which I find interesting by itself, but I was even more intrigued by the second part, what you did with your language at school level. Because I'm always looking for innovations and most likely challenging innovations for schools. So I focus my discussion on chapter 6, the large-scale experiment of the language. And my main remark is, and I will illustrate that with some examples if you don't mind, that it seems that this chapter is rather full with wishful interpretations of selective data. First, the title is Large-Scale Experiment, but on page 100 you conclude, therefore we cannot term our evaluation as large-scale, because you said there was a specific user group, and it was only a subset of ROILA. And I have no idea, and not from your chapter, how that affects your evaluation. Other doubts I have is about how you interpret outcomes that are not completely outcomes that you do not like, let me put it this way. For instance, on page 100 you say, nevertheless, the low scores in the game, that's the shooting game, cast a minor doubt, in your interpretation, over the applicability of this particular game scenario for ROILA. Another point, and I think that's about a specific user group, if I understand you correctly, is that for your experiment, 100 students for curriculum were invited, and now 35 were invited out of the 100 that did the ROILA curriculum. And then you add, which is very honest, all agreed with enthusiasm, they were selected, recommendations of the science teacher, that was remarkable in my set because it was not the language teacher, and completion of homework. Now this is a very strong selection, of course, of the group that you were working with. And it was only a very small group, 35 students. Small because later on you make even all kinds of different subgroups, girls, boys, VWO, HAVO, etc. I regret to tell you that on page 95 there aren't even absolute numbers of participants. There are only mean and standard deviation, so I cannot completely see what exactly the value is of this table. But one of the things that struck me very much is that you ignore completely the fact that the male HAVO students performed very much lower than all the other groups. And that would be interesting to know what your interpretation is. Finally, I think that on page 96, it is disputable if you can even use graphs if you have such small numbers. And if it's valid to call the three outliers there really outliers, and to interpret the result of the left scatter plot with an outcome that the longer you study, the lower you score, needs a little bit more discussion, but on the other hand, I don't think it's a valid interpretation of the data whatsoever. You use the words not statistically reliable or not significant, and significance was kind of maybe arbitrariness, in my opinion. For instance, when you choose your group to do the real experiment, you say that their scores are a half point or 0.6 higher on a 10-point scale than the group that was not selected. And you say that's not significant, the difference. But I can tell you, in reality, your scale is of course only 5 points, as you illustrate also in the graphs. And then a 0.6 of a point is quite a significant difference, especially for the social effect of such differences. So my final question is, how do you reflect on chapter 6, taking into account these kind of questions? Because I think it's very important to know what the future might bring for things like this in an actual classroom, whether it be science or mathematics or language. That's another question. Thank you.
Okay.
These are a whole series of questions. You have all the questions?
Yeah, I think I have about 5 or 6 remarks.
If not, then I invite your opponents to intervene whenever it's
Yes,
necessary.
the main question is what I did at the end, you know, how valid is what is presented in chapter 6 and what does it promise for the future?
Hooggeleerd opponent, thank you for this for the questions. The first remark that you made was about the way I use the word large scale. So in one sense, what you're saying is completely true, and perhaps I was not that clear in the way I used the word. So like the title of the chapter is indeed conducting a large scale study. So when I say large scale in terms of conducting a study, I mean large scale in terms of 3 weeks or 4 weeks. So we stayed there, we went to the school and we exposed them for ROILA for 3 weeks. It was just not half an hour of a controlled experiment. We actually gave the lessons.
Can you tell me how many hours per week?
Class time was about 2 to 3 hours. So when I say large scale, I mean large scale in terms of time. And when I say large, we did not use ROILA in large scale, it means that we did not evaluate ROILA as a whole. So we didn't look at all 800 words, we didn't look at all the grammar, mainly the words. So we didn't evaluate all of the words together because that was practically impossible. I mean, in 3 or 4 weeks you can only do that much. So what you're saying is true. The use of large scale, possibly at 2 contradicting places, could have been better, but I hope I've clarified what I meant. The second remark you had was about the use of ROILA for this gaming scenario. So that was just what I meant to say was that when we looked at the game scores, we saw that the children were not doing so well; they were not scoring so high. I think the reason is, and I also say that in the thesis, it's not really just because recognition was not working. It was about the game context itself, because the game probably was a bit too difficult for them to play it and score well. Because, I mean, like they had to bring the robot on top of circles, but the circles were too small. So the accuracy of, let's say the accuracy of movement of the robot would mean that by the time they say stop, the robot would have already crossed the circle. And then they would say back, and then it would cross the circle again.
But you make that clear in the thesis.
Yeah.
The question then remains, shouldn't you have used another game or have improved the game in order to get a more valid outcome?
That would have been the best. That would have been the best alternative. But by the time we had analyzed, I mean, the study was conducted and then we analyzed the scores, and by that time it probably would have been possible to make another game and then have them come again and do the same study again. So again, practical reasons. The user group, the third remark was about the user group. So how was the selection controlled? How did you get 35 from 100? And that, I got several remarks about that, and I agree there's a bias. So I think that the bias was unavoidable. Why? Because some of the students didn't participate in the learning process. So for example, they missed some classes, or they didn't do the homework, or they weren't just being attended. And if I had used those students, it would mean that they wouldn't have known ROILA. I mean, all of them knew English because they learned it at school. But if they didn't know ROILA, then it would be like I would be beating my head against the wall, because I mean, they don't speak ROILA, and then I'm trying to compare that against English, and they don't. So the idea was that we should get a pool of students who took part in the learning process, who have some interest with Lego and playing with Lego, and that's why we had this discussion with the science teachers, and we thought which students would be the most appropriate to choose. And I also say that in the thesis, the exam scores played no part. So we didn't look at the exam scores. We only had pictures of students and their names. And I mean, spending time with them for 3 weeks meant that I got to know them pretty well, and I could, suggest and say. And the teachers, of course, knew them for several months or if not years. So yeah, so the idea was to get students who had took part in the learning process, but at the end, and I even say that in the thesis, we agree that there's a bias, but in my opinion, the bias was unavoidable. And then you had a question about the Harvard students and why the male students were doing so bad. So again, I mean, we had several groups. So we had the HAVO and we had the VWO, and we tried to see which kind of, let's say, education section in terms of VWO and HAVO were doing better. And I think the idea is that HAVO are more. The way they're given their education, it's more, let's say, hands-on, and it's not so. VWO are more like they get theoretical education. So this could be one possible explanation of this effect. Yeah, and then there was a question about the outliers. So on the regression.
Well, whether you can even draw those graphs, that is my question. It's not that the outliers make it even more unreliable, in my opinion. It's on page 96, because we have so few data, and the spread is so, it's only 3 points, from 6 to 9, so what does it mean?
Yeah. Yeah, but in the thesis I do state that we think, at least, I think that there might be a trend, but we think that this is not statistically reliable. So we really think that, I'm not making a very strong statement. I'm not saying and setting this in stone that, the more time you spend at home makes your score go down, because, the scarcity of data is one reason. We didn't have enough data points. We only had 24. But the conclusion is that I agree with what you're saying, and and that's why we don't make a very strong statement. Otherwise, I could have given something very concretely that the more time you spend at home means you're just not good at languages because you're spending more time. And I think to really find out the answer to that, you would really need to conduct a more rigorous study with several more participants, and only then you would be able to answer this question.
But do you see any chances or future for ROILA to be incorporated, let's say, robotics, science, mathematics lessons in the future?
Yeah, so an example of that is that the License College is using that as part of their curriculum. So that in itself answers the question, I think.
No, I tend to disagree because there seems also to be some revision necessary.
Yeah, so, but yeah, I mean, it was our first attempt, and we didn't, of course, it was also an experience for us, so we tried to make changes along the way, and we learned several things. So like, one of the things was that the number of words were too many. Even in 3 weeks, learning 50 words was too much. And so we sat down with the science teachers, we agreed on a number of changes the next year. But I think what should really be retained is the Lego aspect and the robots aspect, and talking to robots, playing with robots. And that is something that the school really wants to focus on, and rather not just focus only on the linguistic and the theoretical part, but also focus on the playing part, because that's where the children really like to do. So ROILA the ROILA curriculum had its weaknesses, so we tried to fix those weaknesses, and so that it's better for next time.
It was quite a dialogue, but you're satisfied with the answers given?
Almost.
Okay.
Can I just take 1 more minute?
Yeah, sure.
Because I was intrigued by your answer of the low score of the boys in the HAVO, because you said a possible reason could be that it's a little bit more practical and hands-on, right? Did I recall that correctly?
Yeah.
Yeah, less academic than VWO. But the problem I have is that in VWO, the difference between boys and girls is 0.3.
Yeah.
And at HAVO, 1.7.
Yeah.
So the girls probably didn't have hands-on education. How can you explain almost 2 points difference between the girls and the boys in the HAVO? You know that, I mean, it's not part of the thesis.
Yeah.
But I think this is an intriguing question.
Yeah, I mean, a gender effect is always difficult to explain, and most of the times you can only speculate. And for me personally, I'm not really fully aware of how the Dutch high school system works, and so that's one of the undermining effects that I have. So if I had been part of the Dutch high school, I would have known what really happens, and then probably I would give you a better answer. But yeah, I mean, in science, in our research, we always struggle to explain the gender effect, and most of the times it remains unexplained.
Thank you very much.
I think a very interesting research I have followed is just studying the difference between either half of area or boys and girls. But there have been other studies on that as well. I would like the opposition to be continued by one of the co-promoters, Dr. Bartnek. And although Dr. Bartnek was currently a member of staff of this university, he is now a member of staff at the University of Christchurch in New Zealand, and we warmly appreciate him coming over such a long distance. Dr. Bartnek, the floor is yours.
It's the University of Canterbury.
Okay. But it's a movie, don't say.
It is a movie. I have a question, and that's also about the selection bias of the 35 out of the 100. And I was wondering, you said enthusiasm was an important criteria, but how did it work? I mean, were those 35 students that you selected, were they actually better in terms of ROILA, in terms of the score they had in the ROILA exam?
Okay. Sergio Laird, co-promoter, thank you for the question. The exam basically played no part. When I say enthusiasm, I meant that enthusiasm in class. So how, let's say, how bubbly, how energetic they are when playing with Lego and interacting in class. Because just to give an example, several students would, when you have a class, you have a mixture of students. You have the backbenchers, you have those who are always talking, and I mean, you have several students were really just not that interested.
But was there a difference in terms of how well they scored on the ROILA language test between those that you selected and those that you did not select?
So yeah, I report on the statistical analysis on the test, and it was nearing significance.
It was what?
It was nearing significance.
Yeah, it's about 9.
Yeah, it was not significant. Yeah. So it was, yeah, and it was. It's the same remark that I made earlier, that there was this bias, but it was unavoidable, because if we had chosen students who had not taken part in the learning process, it would have just clouded the whole recognition experiment.
The second question. In the first design of the ROILA vocabulary, there was one word missing. Do you remember which one it was?
In the first, you mean in the first cycle?
Yes.
Global?
Exactly.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Yeah, so that is, so we generated the first vocabulary. We took all the semantics from Basic English. And Basic English doesn't have a word for robot. So robo in ROILA means robot in English. And then when we exposed the language to people and media and everybody, and then the first remark was that you have this language for robots, but you don't have a word for robots. So what's going on? But the good thing about the whole approach and the whole algorithm is that you can actually ask it to generate more words. So keeping the 800 words that I already had, I asked I made the algorithm generate 100 more words, keeping those 800 in account. So I have like 900 words. And from those 100 words, then I could just assign any meaning. So they were like, I call them wildcard words. And it's like somebody said, you have, I think we have apple, but we don't have eat. You have pants, but you don't have wear. And something. So there were lots of words which were missing, and using those wildcard words, we could give them any meaning that we want based on our context and our requirements. So we had logo, it looked nice, it was short. Yeah. So now logo is logo.
Thank you very much.
You're satisfied with the answer given?
Very much so.
Thank you. Then the opposition will be continued by the secretary of the examination committee, and that's Dr. Terken. Dr. Terken, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. After Convendus, I want to compliment you on your thesis. I think it was a daring enterprise. The design of the language was done very carefully. The design decisions were well documented. I think the evaluation was a great achievement, taking into consideration the remarks that Professor Lange made. But we all know how difficult it is to do experiments in the wild, certainly involving secondary school students, involving that for several weeks. So I think it was a great achievement. My question relates to the viability of the enterprise. So it relates a bit to the question that Professor Kramer already asked. Let me first then relate it to the results that you find in chapter 6. The performance for the language now is 64%. So the speech recognition performance with a limited domain, limited vocabulary. It still compares quite well to the 45% that you find for English, which is probably due to word length and word structure. So these were precisely the elements that you designed into the language. However, to increase the expressive power, the language will need to be extended. So you will have to add more words. For instance, not only in the first version there was no word for robot, in the current version there's also no word for sorry. So the system cannot even say, I'm sorry, if it misrecognized something. And extending the language will of course then affect the performance of the system. As I said, you have given much effort to optimize the word structure of ROILA, making it more resistant to all kinds of effects that give the recognizer a hard time, co-articulation effects, reduction effects, and so on. But if you increase the vocabulary, for instance, increasing the expressive power of the language, also the complexity of the language, of the word model will increase, the language model, sorry, which will then also affect the recognition. So my question would be, do you have a means to estimate the relative contributions of word structure and complexity? So word structure relates to the acoustic structure of the language. Complexity relates to the expressive power of the language. And could you predict then what would happen to performance with a larger, more expressive vocabulary, and whether then it would still make sense to design an artificial language instead of exploring other solutions?
Circular opponent, thank you for the question. So the first question was about the generally low recognition accuracy that we saw. So ROILA was 65%, English was something in the 40s, and they don't look too high. One way which I think that you would improve these accuracies is by using a tailored acoustic.
Yeah.
So right now we just use an American English acoustic model, and perhaps if I had a ROILA acoustic model, the 65% would even go up. And what must be kept in mind that we only use an English acoustic model, and still English is doing so bad. So that already means that when the whole thing starts up, ROILA is already on a back foot. Its back is against the wall because the acoustic model is for English and you're comparing it against English. So I think the way to go in the future would be to have a ROILA tailored acoustic model, and then we might expect that these recognition accuracies would go up further. The second question that you made is also very interesting, and I think it's something that really raises a very interesting thoughts. Is that out of perplexity and word structure, which has the more, let's say, more weight, if I understood correctly. And let's say if you have more words in a vocabulary, what does that mean for the recognition accuracy? So if I go back to the design of the grammar, we had exactly the same criteria. So we had like the number of words, what would happen if we have more words, what would happen to the recognition accuracy, and then we gave weights to them. One thing that must be kept in mind is that anything that makes the recognition accuracy better probably even makes it difficult for the user to learn. So you have these two opposites which are continuously pulling each other apart, and it makes it really difficult to find the right balance, and that's what we've tried to do in the whole project. The answer to your question would be that to give you a quantitative estimate that the grammar plays 60% of a part, the vocabulary plays. This would mean that I would need to do individual, let's probably even a control experiment where I would have, let's say, vocabularies of different complexity level, and then I would see how do they affect the recognition accuracy, and have more variety in the word structure. Right now I only have 3 types of words. So I could have more syllables, less syllables, and so to really give you a really good, accurate quantitative estimate of which is more important than the other, an objective answer would be would mean for me to do another control experiment where I would have different conditions of each factor.
May I basically,
Yes.
so still concerning the viability of this enterprise,
Yes.
so I think that that is just intuition that complexity will play a large role if you extend the expressive language. And to make things more complicated, we can take a look at the scenarios of use. You don't include much information about the envisaged scenarios of use, but on page 2 I think you mentioned some examples. So for instance, to support people, disabled people, physically impaired people, but also an application domain which is very interesting to me, which is in-car systems, and then you refer to navigation systems. So So in that case, in navigation systems, we know that people want to specify street names and so on. And street names then will not satisfy the constraints of the ROILA language. So do you envisage a situation where ROILA is mixed with natural language words, with natural language word structure? And then what would happen to the recognition problem?
Yeah. So yeah, that would be one option that you have. You mix ROILA with, let's say, English or Dutch. But I think that we're slightly convoluting the real application of ROILA, and probably it's also in the introduction, because I gave these examples, probably meant that I unfortunately misled the reader. But I don't really mean to say that I want ROILA to be used with the elderly, or I want ROILA to be used in the car. For me, ROILA is just a language that you use to talk to robots, and and that's what we researched on. We didn't look into scenarios for like navigation GPS systems or for the elderly, and because that opens a whole new can of worms. So we didn't step into that. We didn't research on that. For me, ROILA is just a language that I would use to talk to a robot, and that would be the end of the application.
To do certain things.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, well, yeah. I mean, play a game. I mean, social robots. What do they do? I mean, the Roomba vacuums your house, and so I would think that the words that you have in a house would probably be in the vocabulary of the robot. But what you say is completely right. What would happen if there are street names? And street names are not part of the vocabulary. So yeah. So for the time being, I stay away from navigation systems and reality.
Okay, thank you.
You're satisfied with the answers given? Then this PhD committee has two co-promoters. We have already had Dr. Bartnek in your position as one of the co-promoters. I want now to give the floor to the other co-promoter, that is Dr. Boe. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman. Geachte promovendus, before I forget it, and Wolfgang Woensdag in Holland. First of all, congratulations on a very interesting piece of work. That was my pleasure to read the thesis and guide you through the last piece of the work. I have actually basically two questions. First one is quite easy to answer. The second one could take you more time. The first one is regarding a sentence you have in page 104. It says, let me read. We recommend that words should follow the CV structure, but a speaker might also want to have words such as CV. And for me, it's really hard to understand what you mean by that. And that's the first question. And the second question is regard to page 6. And we all know that ROILA language is inspired by the graffiti handwriting recognition, because graffiti was designed for a machine to recognize human handwriting. If I look at the design of graffiti, I found myself quite comfortable, because the way graffiti writes about O and P, M, somehow very close to my writing habit. So if I remember when I learned graffiti, it took me like a few minutes, then I get used to it, because I love my old writing habit. It is actually implemented, taking into account in the new design. The difficulty I had with ROILA, because I also tried to learn ROILA in 5 minutes, and I failed, because I found my many years of practicing English was not taken into account in ROILA language, and my 30 years of experience in speaking Chinese, I can't find any implementation in the new language. I can't take any experience why, if you take the farm approach, why didn't you consider some of the language habits of the users could be implemented in new design? Can I conclude that the language was designed for robots, not for humans, not for humans to speak?
Sir Frederick Walker-Motor, thank you for the two questions. The first question is basically what do I mean when I say CV word, and I agree that the sentence is a bit ambiguous. When I say CV, I just mean one syllable, so ba or pa or something like that. So we don't have one syllable words at this moment, but you could want to have them. I mean, a user could want to have them, but I don't think they would work too well with any kind of recognizer. The second question was about Graffiti. The whole thing with Graffiti and Palm is that it was our inspiration. So we, at the start of the project, we looked at Graffiti and said, this is what we want to do for a language. And that's all well and good, and that's all fine. But during the process, during the whole research, I found out that finding a balance, and it was, I wouldn't say it's impossible, but it was very difficult. So I was always faced with this dilemma of, should I do this, when I pick this design feature, should I do it because the machine likes it, or should I do it because the user wants it, or a human? And the conclusion that I made is that any particular design feature that you have, in most likely, in most of the times, we would have this conflict. It would be good for the machine, but bad for the user, or vice versa.
But I could think of solutions like a dog is very much different from something like a photo.
Yeah.
These kind of things could be still valid for the owners and also for the robots.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I did take into account. I mean, the whole overview chapter of languages was an attempt to see, can we borrow something from these languages? Can we? So like the choice of phonemes comes from the common phonemes. Like I can give you a specific example. I have both M and N. Both M and N are spoken by many people. I mean, by most people. But M and N have a very high probability of being confused by the recognizer. So at that point, at this particular design feature, I made, I gave a preference to the user. What I'm alluding to is the fact that to satisfy the user and the machine at the same time is not an easy task. The point that you make is that why not, I guess what you're trying to say is that why not just use English and have some words of English?
Yeah, you could take some distinguishable words from English as a seed for a generic organism. Okay? Yeah. And then start from there, and then people found some familiar words that to be taken into account, that they feel that they're respected of their own ways of talking to robots.
Yeah. So, well, if I could give another example, I would say Esperanto is one of the most popular artificial languages. And what does Esperanto do? It also takes its vocabulary from natural languages, so it tries to borrow. So like, just to give a very general example, the word for chair would be the word for chair that's let's say a combination, or like let's say in Italian, Spanish, they have the same word for chair, even in French. So they say in Esperanto the word for chair would be that, because then it's easier for the speakers. So then it means that, yeah, well, to satisfy the user is pretty difficult.
Maybe a last question about R and R. Did you consider to make a difference in the language?
I'm afraid that the R and R we have to discuss at a later time during the reception. May I invite the candidate to take his place back in the audience? Kort deze vergadering. De commissie trekt zich terug voor beraad.
Dank u, commisleider.
Please be seated. Ik heropen deze zitting van het College van Promoties van de Technische Universiteit Eindhoven. May I invite you to stand in front of these tables. Het College voor Promoties van de Technische Universiteit Eindhoven, door ons vertegenwoordigd, heeft kennis genomen van dit proefschrift en heeft uw verdediging gehoord. Op grond hiervan heeft het College voor Promoties besloten u de graad van dokter te verlenen. Ik verzoek de eerste promotor zich van de hem opgedragen taak te kwijten. Please all rise.
Bij kracht van de bevoegdheid, ons toegekend door de wet, en namens het College voor Promoties bevoordig ik u, Omar Mubin, tot dokter en verleen ik u de rechten die verbonden zijn aan de dokterstitel. Ten bewijs hiervan overhandig ik u het diploma ondertekend door de rector magnificus en de promotoren en bekrachtigd met het zegel van de Technische Universiteit Eindhoven.
Please be seated.
Dear Omar, dear Dr. Mubin, it's a great pleasure for me to call you with your new title. I'm not sure whether there's a ROILA word for doctor, but I understand you can always run your generator again to make sure future robots will address you appropriately. Doctor's title is a great and precious privilege, and now you are a serious member of the scientific community. Your research may start already during your UZI studies, perhaps already in Sweden, where you were already working with robots. One day you walked into the office of Christoph Bachneck and told him that you were interested in robots. This was during your UZI years, and you then worked with Christoph on a couple of experiments besides your regular studies. You showed always great enthusiasm. After graduation you applied for a PhD position, and you and Christoph and me and Jim, you worked for 3 more years. You never stopped working. Even when you were supposed to be on vacation in your homeland, Pakistan, you took the iCat with you and you performed some more robotic experiments with the local children, for example. And let me also explain this to the audience. You do have very strong publication records. I counted over 30 peer-reviewed publications. You never stopped talking about your work. Your work is a strong example of contemporary design. Whereas traditional design was about tangible stuff, cars, furniture, fabrics, now intangibles are being designed. For example, a language. I think you have set a strong example by proposing your work as a design thesis, a proefontwerp as we call it in Dutch. After you have begun in our research group, we have researchers such as Jun Wu and Dr. Barakova, who also know about social robotics and try to push the frontiers of knowledge in projects on this topic further. Special word of thanks goes to the Lego company, who generously sponsored your research project. We at TUE are honored by the visit of the Lego representative today, Stephen Kevin, the Mindstorm community members, and I hope that the quality of Omar's work, the sustainable science classes at Huygens College, also the presence of Professor De Lange, the founder of the Curious Minds program, Talentkap in Dutch, This shows that here at TUV we appreciate societal innovation. We understand the impact of constructive play for children, actually constructive play for all of us. Another important event, Omar, during your thesis was certainly the birth of your child. You are a responsible father now who takes care of a whole family. I can imagine that it was a difficult choice for you to decide whether to take your family to Singapore or Switzerland. Singapore would be closer to your home culture, but EPFL has an outstanding reputation for world-class research in Switzerland. In some rankings, EPFL is even higher than TUV. So you decided to bring your family to the Alps, and I'm certain that you will climb many mountains, academically and physically. Congratulations.
I want to thank, of course, the members of the PhD committee. I want to thank also the first promoter on his very nice words. And I want to add on that the congratulations of Eindhoven University of Technology on a job well done.
Thank you.
It is part of my job, however, also to point you out not only the rights that you have deserved as a doctor, that indeed carrying the doctor's title, but also the duty that you have to proper execute scientific principles. It's one of the very important things of a doctorate, and we have full confidence in you that you will behave accordingly. May I invite you now to take back your seat in the audience, although for a very short while. Deze vergadering is gesloten.